So, how does the finance industry work? And yes, this is another big subject. And so I thought, like I normally do, I suppose, I'm just going to dive straight in. Now, so we all know of or we work for or we've worked with investment banks. I should say for the people that haven't worked in finance, everyone's heard of investment banks, the finance industry, private equity, venture capital, angel investing, public limited companies, PLCs, limited liability partnerships, special purpose vehicles, sole traders, and self-employed. I suppose self-employed is just a status of an individual working for themselves, but these phrases are all phrases of associated to the finance industry. And essentially, as it suggests, it finances things. The industry provides money, it finances. So I suppose this focus is going to be more investment banks, private equity, venture capital, angel investing. And also your high street bank, so a straightforward an unsecured loan, which tends to mean a loan from a high street bank, and the values are very small. Right, so how does the finance industry work? It's a big subject. And there are many forms of finance, but I think for this video what I'm going to do is focus on the very general outline of the different types of finance, what that roughly means, but I'm also going to add what it means to society, what it means for society, and what the implications are for society and the wider macroeconomic environment. And I suppose this it is party to other videos I've done on where I've mentioned central banks and money and Bitcoin. So this subject matter is all related. But I suppose in this video what I'm going to try and do is offer a brief overview of what it means in a more wider context, the implications of it, and I think I'm going to end up offering some plus points and some negative points, like I normally do. Right. Often when I'm generally in conversation with people, for example, at a networking event, at a business pitch event, or when I've been to other finance-related events, often very cliched sentences are made, like investment banks are bad, private equity houses are bad, venture capitalists are bad, because they put too much pressure on those businesses to perform, and the focus becomes nothing but profit making and profit taking. Cash cowing seems to be the thing that everybody wants to do. Now, what's interesting is that is an overgeneralized comment, but the interesting thing also is that it is a generalized comment, and quite often people do have a general opinion that investment banks and the finance industry is out to get them. It's out to control them. It's out to take everything that it can. Now, to a degree, I have to agree with that, and often I will have said things similar to that in any case. Because if you look at it very globally, it doesn't matter what finance institution you are looking at, essentially that thing needs to loan money to another thing in return for that money being returned with interest. So straightforward, there is a pressure and an expectation set upon the recipient of that investment that makes them need to deliver to satisfy the contractual obligations that they will have entered into when they receipted the money, the investment. Now, the reason investment banks often have a bad reputation is because they are, I suppose, a little more visible, and there is more of them, and they are bigger than the private equity industry and the venture capital industry, and also hedge funds, because they are also more on the selling products side. So they sell lots of services, and these days investment banks tend to have their fingers in many pies. In fact, they have their fingers in everything. So they are they're on the buy side as well as the sell side, which is very interesting because you have a straightforward conflict of interest in many cases. But also, it means that they have significant control over things as well, over wider decision making. But I suppose where I'm going to dive in at this point is, where the money comes from. So, and especially when you mention investment banks, private equity, hedge funds, well, in particular those three, you're normally talking about lots of money, big sums of money. Sums of money that start around the $50 million mark and go up. Venture capital can deal with that size of money, but tends to be more focused on startups, smaller enterprises. There can still be large amounts, but not the real big stuff that investment banks, private equity, and what they fund. Okay, but essentially what the finance industry does, what it means, and I so in this, not the world context, although we can take it to that level, but in a more local context, so a society level. What they are doing is they're taking money from somewhere, they're obtaining the money from already wealthy people or institutions, and they also have access to money. They also have access to money from the central bank, which is also very interesting. And they basically collect that money, attach fees to the managing of it, and a contractual agreement to that money, and then they lend it to individuals or companies with the expectation that individual or companies will use that money to build the value proposition of the thing that they do. And so very briefly, that's the whole business case for the finance industry. They have access to money. They give it to a third party that desperately needs that money in most cases. They do something that creates value, and when that thing makes a profit, they then repay the money that they've borrowed. Now, Okay, so that what I've just said there actually describes a debt financing. So that's more what private equity does. But also there is equity investing where just equity investing where money is given to the third party. They then sell equity in the company to the provider of that finance. So the equity does not have to be repaid, but it is paid in projected profits of the vehicle, the company, the business that they've invested into. Now, it does get a little bit complicated, and I'm just thinking to myself, I'll stay away from all the variations, and I'll just keep it at this top level, because that's the point I'm hoping to make in this video. But essentially, the money is obtained by a third party that needs it. The money needer, the customer of this finance. And they need it so that they can purchase resources and labour, skill, and they can coordinate the efforts around the value build proposition so that they make a profit. And with that profit, they pay the terms of they pay back the money. And however you do it, essentially that's what's happening. But let's once again go back to where the investment capital comes from. So we've said it comes from individuals, it comes from investment houses that simply have money that they want to lend out, or it comes from central banks. Now, all the avenues where that money comes from, not necessarily does the general public have access to, or companies have access to. There is a little bit of a thing here that's a little unfortunate, because if you are a company and you need some significant investment, you do have to go to these investment houses. You do have to go to private equity or investment banks to actually obtain this finance. You yourself can't actually go to a high street bank anymore and say, "Hey, high street bank, can I borrow a load of cash at terms that work for both of us?" The high street banks, they do offer some business loans, but they do seem to be diminishing, forcing everyone to use these professional services. Now, straight away, what that means is that these professional services, they need to make a living themselves. They have lots of people, lots of highly skilled people that all need paying. And what that really represents is a load of cost. So what that also means is that borrowing money is expensive. And today, it's very expensive. You can borrow $5 million or £5 million or €5 million from a private equity house, and depending on how you've borrowed that money, it's highly likely that the expectation is that they will want double that in return over 3 to 5 years. Now, turning £5 million into £10 million, that requires an awful lot of hard work, an awful lot of very successful business operations, an awful lot of delighted customers if you sell a product. But essentially, that is a lot of pressure. And even if you were able to borrow the £5 million as debt, and in some cases it is cheaper, you are still going to be heading towards at least half of that or double that again, in that time period. So yes, borrowing money is very, very expensive. Now, many times, lots of business models, lots of successful companies, a successful company these days, I would say, would be a business operation that has a 10% profit ratio. So essentially, what they turn over, 10% of that is profit, with accepted costs being discounted there. But many industries, for example, like the car industry, they operate on razor thin profit margins. It's between 1% and 3%. If we go back to a good business that has a profit ratio of 10%, if they borrow $5 million, for example, repaying that $5 million with a 10% profit ratio business, could be quite difficult, and that $5 million that they need might be more to keep them in their industry, in the environment that they are in, where they achieve the 10% profit ratio. So, it can be very, very hard. So what happens is that investment houses, investors, they are looking for businesses that are, in their view, underperforming greatly and or badly managed, or they require something that they know they naturally won't obtain, and the investor has access to it. And so that's why they're interested in that business, because they know they have something that they can bring to that business operation that will increase the value build proposition. Actually, I won't go too much into that because it'll make this the point of this video difficult to get to the point. Right. So I'm chatting. I'm going off piste a little bit here. I want to get back to where this money comes from. So today it could be widely viewed that there is an amount of unfairness and inequality, and I suppose the unfairness might be a word that best describes it, because if you are a business operation and you need to borrow money, it's going to be very costly to borrow that money, and you're probably going to end up agreeing to terms that you don't really want to agree to. For example, like allowing decision makers into your company that can veto your decision. Or you'll agree to repayment terms that basically mean that you've lost your business long term, because fulfilling those business agreements means, in effect, you're going to lose control of your company. Or you will put your company under so much pressure, financial pressure, cost-cutting pressure, that you end up destroying the business or harming it in a way. But not all businesses seem to have it difficult. If you are a certain type of business, for example, if you are a certain private equity house, in a crazy way, it seems to be easy for you to access finance. It appears to me that many private equity companies can pick up the phone, access investment, and that's as easy as a phone call almost, and followed up with an email. Now, that of course will be because of past performance and the vendor of the money trusts that they'll get it back, etc. But the man in the street, the business owner, certainly doesn't have access to that, to that cash flow, that businesses often need. So it does, without me going into many details, my general view is that more often than not, there is an element of inequality, there's an element of unfairness that is heavily operated in our financing space in our local environments, in our regional violence, and to a large degree in the country you're in. Number one, you need to be in a privileged position to obtain that finance. Number two, you need to be in a privileged position and or have the correct connections with the finance industry to have access to talking to people with that money. And then you need to have a business proposition, a value build proposition that everyone believes in. Each of those things is not easy to come by, actually. And I would say that these days, having the value build proposition is the real hard thing, because we live in a very technology enabled world. Competition is always very high unless you're in a monopolized sector, where then other factors control players in that industry space. But we can end up in I think many people could agree that it's not perfect, and we perhaps are heading more and more into an unfair space. Now, I'm going to add there my opinion that this environment that we're in is also contributing to inequality. Because unless you are in the right gang, you're in the right industry, you have the right friends, you're not going to have access to the people with money in any case, never mind convince them to pay you, to give you the money, to loan you the money. But at this point, I'm just going to expand this chat a little wider, because if you look at the finance industry in a local area, even zoom up to a country context, and you look at cash supply as a whole, where the money comes from, actually, how I understand it, it actually comes from everybody, because that whole cash supply is in the total area of people using it. So in actual fact, when you borrow large amounts of money, that money, viewing it one way, it could be seen that it actually comes from you yourself, because you will have paid that in maybe indirect taxation, or in some cases direct taxation, or you've bought products that are expensive that end up being profit in a company that ends up lending you money so that you can do something with that investment. So if there is an industry that ends up being or operates a lot like a gatekeeper to all economic activity, to the lifeblood of economic activity, or is the industry that controls all the doors, knobs and levers and locks to resource, well, we've ended up describing a situation that very quickly appears to be unfair, although it might not be unfair, because perhaps it has become nature of the beast, and I'm quite sure that investment houses can offer very good arguments that will detail that they do so much due diligence, that they are so careful, they do all their research, and ultimately they want the recipients of investment to work, and they do all that research to make sure that happens as well. So this is where it gets a bit tricky to explain, or it gets tricky to offer details and information that's highly believable. But I think on the face of it, we can see that there are some issues here, or issues might not be the right word. There are circumstances that need to be looked at closer to further explain, is it working well? One of the measurements that I use that indicates that perhaps it's not working well is the cost of that service. And right now, borrowing money is very, very expensive. Roughly speaking, once again, if you were to borrow £1 million, it's likely that in 3 years' time, the person that loaned you that £1 million wants double, it wants 2 million back. So we have these horrible return factors that that put massive pressure on that business. Having to repay back the principal, the initial investment, plus that again in such a short space of time is very difficult. Now, of course, there will be people will claim now that it's not that expensive. There is this vehicle that offers this money, etc. So yes, but on the whole, I think everyone can agree it is very expensive to borrow money, which in turn puts a lot of pressure on the person or the business that borrows that money. But the bit that makes it harder, or I think has some other negative side effects that we need to focus on, is this inequality creating aspect of the wider implications of the investment industry on the general public. Because also what's happening is investment banks with private equity and other investor vehicles that are in our world today, what's happening is that they are able to get hold of money very easily, and lots of it, and they're able to buy assets like homes, like property, that are in high demand and that are expensive anyway. And this has a severe knock-on to the general public, because it removes disposable income from their pockets, which in turn drives up the cost of living, which in turns up labour cost to companies, which makes obviously something as important as a house very expensive to a point where it's unobtainable, which then puts pressure on the housing market, which increases prices there. So the whole thing is a vicious, very, very negative circle. What it can do for a country is it can make your gross domestic product so expensive that you can no longer trade with other companies, with other countries, which can destabilize your country's economy or your currency, which then has a negative effect, which means that your currency is actually less valuable because less other countries want to trade with you. So it is a vicious circle, and this is exactly why right now interest rates, quantitative tightening, are terms that are used almost every day in the news media, and most people don't really understand what they are. But that's what they are addressing. They're trying to balance up this economic activity in a local environment, in a regional environment, and in a national and country environment. You can actually view all this on a macro world scale, and that's where it becomes very interesting, because it helps you see why there is political tensions between countries. But that's on a macro level, and so let's just come back in again to a more a smaller national country macro level. So yeah, the finance industry has an awful lot of responsibility on its shoulders. It's very powerful, and that power given to it is unfortunately probably not a good thing, because it's allowing them to do what the hell they like, and it's also enabling them to own a lot more stuff, upsetting the balance of society. And I think actually what I've just said there is the point that I'm wanting to make. The investment industry has become too powerful. It has too much significance over the control of resources and people, which is creating more inequality, which is actually contributing to, I believe, civil unrest. As the general population have less money in their pockets, they're less able to buy things, which has a direct negative impact on the economy anyway. There will be created a more unhappy feeling, and also a feeling of unfairness, which makes people point the finger and start to do a witch hunt. And that witch hunt is very quickly going to end up with everyone pointing at the finance industry and investment banks and private equity houses that are mentioned often in the news media. Because if everyone's looking for, if everyone is presenting themselves as a victim, you're looking for the persecutor, you're looking for the person to blame. And very, very quickly, the person to blame is going to be the investment banks and private equity houses and other investment vehicles, and or the government. But very quickly, if you point at the government, the governments are very good at this. They're going to point the finger at the finance industry, because it's very easy for them to do that, and they can offer the finance industry as the persecutor. It's very plausible, and they can easily do it. So the general public are going to end up looking at the finance industry and pointing. Now, I don't have to mention all the popular finance houses, the investment banks that we've all heard of, but they'll be the first in the firing line. And when they're asked to justify themselves, they will offer a justification, but no one's going to believe it, because the people doing the justifying are going to be driving around in very expensive cars, living in one of their 3 very expensive homes, and no one's going to believe it. They're going to think, yes, you have all the money, you have control of all the money, you are to blame because we, the people, have no money. So that's the real problem. And I suppose that's the point of this video right now, is to illustrate that the finance industry is incredibly important. It is it's an absolute thing that society needs to look at and needs to understand how important it is. And things like the governing of it, legislation that protects the public against it, policies that control it, they all need to be top-notch, A-class, and need to be well thought through, and create this environment that makes it work and that is best for the population. So you can see it's very, very challenging. Anyway, I think at that I'm going to leave it there, because I think I've made the points, although it's a little garbled to get there. This is the risk, going straight to camera on these things. But yeah, so the investment banking industry, or the finance industry, they are incredibly important. It's incredibly important that they get it right. Get it wrong, you have a failed economy, you can have failed governments, you can have hunger, starvation, and civil wars. Get it right, and it's hard to get it right, you will have prosperity for a time, because of how money actually works, and it's fascinating how it does work. And I've alluded to that in other videos, and I will come back to that. Anyway, this video, I'm just making the point that the finance industry is very accountable. It is fraught with danger. Get it wrong, you will make people poor, and they will blame you. Get it right, and it's hard to get right, you'll have prosperity for a length of time. and that is determined by how money works, how central banks work. And I'll come back to that again another time. But I'll leave it there. This might be a bit of a difficult video to get through. It's more of a chit chat. I hope I've made my points. I will come back to this topic again and again. And I'll say ciao for now. I hope everyone is well. It's a very interesting time that we're in right now. This is June 2022. I hope everyone is okay. I hope prosperity finds us and we find prosperity soon. But I do genuinely hope everyone is okay and things get better for all of us. And at that, I shall say goodbye for now.